learn together. I would say one of the great pleasures of participation on this committee for me has been hearing um, contributions by Ben Sachs. Whenever any topic comes up, he always has an astute comment to make, a remark that adds depth and especially nuance to whatever the conversation is. He doesn't see anything as simple as black and white. There's always layers of interpretation, of understanding that I hear in his comments. So it's will not come as any surprise to any of you that he is the head of scholarship and the Jewish scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, which is a very important part of our Baltimore community. He has taught at the university level. He has been a university administrator and has published some remarkable works of scholarship. It's really his initiative that we undertook the project of organizing the trip to the Museum of the Bible. And I'm thrilled that he and his colleague at ICJS, Matt Taylor, have been able to help us prepare for this experience of visiting this museum by sharing background with us. So this evening, we are fortunate to hear Ben's remarks about Philo-semitism and Supersessionism. I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to teach us. Thank you, Ben.
Well, thank you, Barry. That was a remarkably kind introduction. I'm 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 really happy to do this tonight. I put some slides together. I think the goal of this trip is to sort of help us navigate a very, at least in my opinion, a very perplexing time to be Jewish. In addition to the fear with anti-Semitism, there's also a lot of confusion about who supports Jewish people. Um, and the Bible Museum is sort of a place where we're going to have to navigate those really complicated emotions and feelings. So the hope was that Matt would give you a background into to Christian movements so that you can see that the Christianity is not a simple thing. I love the way that he does his trees. That's one of my favorite presentations of his, the intro to Christianity. It's a way that shows that the internal Christian tension is real, and the identities that form out of that tension are important. The thing that I want to talk about tonight is in those tensions in Christianity is their relationship to Jews and Judaism. Um, so the terms Philo-semitism and supersessionism sound like academic terms, but they actually are important in Jewish-Christian relations. And I thought it would be important before we go to the museum to at least get an introduction to the history and context of how these terms were used, and to really try to answer some questions as to what they mean in our current context. Because Philo-semitism, supersessionism are both terms that are going to be used to describe the Museum of the Bible in DC. And that's going to mean something different for each of us. So I will give a very brief history of supersessionism, 15 minutes, an even briefer history of Philo-semitism of 15 minutes, and then our current moment. And then my hope is to leave 15 minutes for discussion. I'm going to be cognizant of time, so I may skip some things if I feel like it's going too slowly, because I really want us to spend some time together talking about these terms. So I want to start with a joke. It's a fairly cynical joke, and it's one that I never liked very much, but I think it's an important one to help us frame the context by which we're entering. So there's a question. So which is preferable, the anti-Semite or the Philo-Semite? The answer is the anti-Semite. At least he isn't lying. And so the understanding is that we should be suspicious of Philo-semitism. Why, where does this love of Jews come from? Is it genuine? Is it not really as a way of serving some other questionable end? And we're going to explore why this joke is a little bit problematic. So, supersessionism. You'll see on my right, I assume it's on your right on your computer too, two statues. And these statues are named Ecclesia and Synagoga. Ecclesia is the statue on the far right with the cross, and Synagoga is the statue of the woman with her eyes blindfolded looking down. This particular statue used to be at the Strasbourg Cathedral. It's now in a museum. Ecclesia represented the triumph of Christianity, of truth and reason, and the immutable truth of history. A synagoga is the rejected Old Testament, the Jewish Testament, looking down in shame as no longer God's favored people, a corrupted people. And the blindfold is blinding themselves in the face of the truth of Jesus and Christianity. And so this type of architecture and sculpture, you'll find this in cathedrals all over Europe. And the idea is that Christianity replaced Judaism. It's a better version. The word supersessionism comes from the Latin supersedere, to sit or to be superior to. In general, to supersede means to take the place of someone or something, while to be superseded means to be set aside as useless or obsolete in favor of someone or something that is regarded as superior. And supersessionism, as I want to talk about tonight, can take on many forms, including a secular form, as we'll find. It's a problem in monotheism more generally. So in Exodus, we have the quote, "You shall have no other gods besides me or before me," as you know from the Ten Commandments. So the idea that we have the true God, it is superior to, or in some cases, replacing the other gods, but that in order to be a religious person, my truth has to in some way be superior to yours. So it's always a horizontal relationship, and it's a relationship fraught with tension. And so this actually is in the Hebrew Bible that extends out into the New Testament. Supersessionism in Christianity is fairly complicated because it was never formally defined as a doctrine in the early church. With the early debates in the church with the Manichaeans and the Christian Jews and the Jews, it was never clear early on the role that Jews played in Christianity. There were questions as whether or not you could become a Christian if you weren't Jewish. One of the contributions of St. Paul, for instance, was allowing pagans to convert to Christianity, where there was a feeling that you couldn't be truly Christian if you weren't also Jewish first. And while it's not formally defined, it is central to Christianity's relationship to Jews and Judaism. Christianity has to have a relationship to Jews and Judaism in a way that Judaism doesn't always need Christianity. Jews and Judaism being replaced is essential to the formation of Christian theology and identity. And then there becomes this implied supersessionism. So Irenaeus and Tertullian in the 2nd century, they want to develop these supersessionist theologies against Marcionism and Judaism. I don't want to go too deep into like a theology course at 7:40 at night. But Marcionism, the basic idea is that the God of the Old Testament is an evil demiurge. It's doing bad things. It's misleading people. The Hebrew Bible itself is corrupt. So Christianity isn't simply replacing one testament with a new. It's actually fighting an old corrupted version. And so Irenaeus and Tertullian developed theologies against both Marcionism and Judaism. And Tertullian is famous for a Latin phrase, credo ad absurdum, which means, that you would believe it because it's absurd. He didn't actually write that. It's more of ad-libbing. But the basic idea is that the more absurd the theology, the more compelling it is. Because in fighting against or debating against Hellenists about the truth of Jesus, they ran into the problem that it's really hard logically and philosophically to justify the incarnation of God in a human being. And what Tertullian said is that because God is beyond our ability to know and our ability to understand, the logic used to define God's will and revelation in the world would also have to defy our reason and logic. So the more absurd the theology, the truer it probably is. And after the Council of Nicaea, supersessionism provided a theological rationale for an imperial policy towards Jews. So you learned last week with Matt, after Constantine, where Christianity becomes an empire, um, supersessionism becomes a justification for that empire because God wants Jews to be persecuted and punished for their rejection and in some cases the murder for the murder of Jesus. Saint Augustine is famous for his paradoxical point of view in that for Augustine, Jews need to be protected and they need to exist for all time so that people can see the synagoga, the stubborn people who look toward the ground, who object truth, as a way to teach the rest of the world that this is who you're going to be if you reject Christ. On the other hand, there's the idea that the Jews serve as desks. It's a really condescending um, image, but Jews are the desks that the Christians write theology on top of, right? They're the foundation, and they're necessary, but ultimately the real work is done by Christians. This third part of implied supersessionism, I think, is the one that had the most danger in the modern period, because during the Enlightenment, it was assumed that uh, with people like Immanuel Kant, that reason will liberate people. That one of the common threads among humanity is that reason exists independent of the person who is reasoning, right? So that a subject, a person, is always going to be thinking in terms of her or himself in relation to others as a way of forming ethics. But reason is independent of that person, independent of that bias. So if you have a connection to reason, you have a connection to truth. And it was understood by a lot of European Enlightenment thinkers that Christianity was closest to this particular view of philosophical reasoning and was preferable to Judaism's narrow, self-interested, particularistic views. I have a picture of Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, who is sometimes more of a footnote in Enlightenment history. But I think what makes him so important in the history of supersessionism is that in the eye of this tornado of the Enlightenment sits Moses Mendelssohn, who was considered at the time one of the greatest thinkers of the Enlightenment. And you run into the problem that he is a traditional Jewish person who has second-class citizenship in Prussia, who is considered philosophically elite, which shouldn't be available for Jews. And Gotthold Ephraim Lessing is famous for writing his plays inspired by Mendelssohn being the great avatar for the Enlightenment. Um, Jacobi makes the claim that part of the problem is that all the Christians and all the Enlightenment proponents of the Enlightenment who love Mendelssohn are what are called crypto-Spinozaists, which for him was really a euphemism for saying they're all atheists. They don't believe in Christianity, so of course they want to elevate a Jewish person because of certain self-proclaimed liberal values, and trying to understand a society more equally, because they actually don't have a universal truth. This becomes a form of supersessionism as well, because um, Jews, by their very nature, then it's assumed can't really have access to this truth because just even in body, they have been superseded. So anti-Judaism and supersessionism and Christian theologies at different points, mostly in European Christian history, create certain violence against Jews. So there's the accusation of deicide against Jewish people of a whole. So that the Jews killed Christ. And then in John 844, I probably should have put that in the slide. There's the assumption that Jews ontologically, meaning that in their being, they have a connection to the devil. And so even when they think they're telling the truth, they're lying. Their whole being is one of being evil as a result of killing God. The blood libel that comes in the 12th century in England comes from this supersessionist point of view. Magda Tater wrote an exemplary work on the history of the blood libel, and what we take away from her research is that most people didn't actually think in terms of supersessionist logic in their everyday because they did have interactions with Jews, and most people were for the most part illiterate. But the intelligentsia, the clergy, the bishops, they wanted to separate Jews and Christians. And this blood libel was created to show that Jews engage in the most odious and nefarious activities, reenacting the killing of Jesus in their own religious ritual. And so it took about a generation for this story to really take hold with the populace because most people pushed back because they knew Jews and knew that this was um, not true. But within a generation, when you talk about the deicide and the supersessionism as a whole, it becomes part of an internal Christian logic that, of course, Jews do these things. By the time you get to the Alhambra Decree, and I said I'd be doing this quickly, I'm jumping ahead of wide swaths of history. In 1492, and the idea that the Jews, even if they converted to Christianity, would still retain some, and this is where it becomes racialized, some biological Jewishness that they can't be trusted, goes part of this supersessionist logic that they had to be replaced now in both body and spirit for truth to inhabit the world. That they can't actually even become Christian anymore. That door closed. By the time you get to Martin Luther's diatribe, it's a 60,000 word anti-Semitic diatribe on the Jews and their lies in 1543, where Luther's famous statement is that, or famous idea is that it's not enough to just loathe and detest Jews, but Christians are responsible if they don't persecute them. He literally writes, if we're not burning down their synagogues and books, we're sinning, right? And Martin Luther, and this is the 1938, those quotes were being parroted by both actually a Catholic in Detroit in 1938, and then Lutheran pastors in Germany during Kristallnacht. So supersessionism, interestingly, has a relationship to colonialism. If colonialism is the idea of replacing people and land with people who should be considered morally and technologically better suited to the land, Christianity gave the internal logic of this type of violence. And these three books here by Jonathan Boyarin, Willie James Jennings, and Colin Kidd look at the theologies of how race was constructed based on this supersessionist and anti-Jewish idea. So if you've spent 14 centuries trying to demonize and other Jewish people who look like you, who speak the same language as you, you already have within your imagination the tools to subjugate and oppress people who literally look different and speak differently and act differently. So Willie James Jennings talks about the theologies of the Christians colonizing the Americas and how it comes from this supersessionist logic. Boyarin's book is interesting because there are a lot of the colonists that see Native Americans as the lost tribe of Israel, as a punished tribe. And Colin Kidd shows how scripture was used in almost every instance in justifying the subjugation of human beings and the colonization of land. So that it's a really tormented history. When you get to the 20th century, um, I wanted to share this quote from Pope Pius XII, who was the Pope, the controversial Pope during the Holocaust in World War II, where he talks about supersessionism in Catholicism. Now, notice they never use the word supersessionist. So this is a word that is used to describe a theology, but nobody says we, the supersessionists, or here is my supersessionist logic. It's a term used to describe this point of view. So by the death of our Redeemer, the New Testament took the place of the old law, which has been abolished. It's a clear supersessionism. The crucifixion of Jesus and the New Testament replace the Old Testament, Judaism. Then the law of Christ, together with its mysteries, enactments, institutions, and sacred rites, was ratified for the whole world in the blood of Jesus Christ. On the gibbet of his death, Jesus made void the law with its decrees and fastened the handwriting of the Old Testament to the cross, establishing the New Testament in his blood shed for the whole human race. So it's not simply enough that Christianity replaced Judaism, but Jesus's own crucifixion has made the Old Testament irrelevant. And in fact, it's the Old Testament that in many ways is the cause of his crucifixion. He saves humanity by replacing it. But after the Holocaust, and after recognizing this tumultuous relationship between theology and violence, there is a move, especially after 1967, which was called Vatican II, where Christians want to replace and repair the theological ideas associated with supersessionism. They want to change the idea that in order to be Christian, they have to replace Jewish people. And so since 1967, there have been efforts, some extraordinary, some mild, but to change the orientation of Christians to think differently about Jews and Judaism. So I wanted to share this quote from Pope Francis in 2013, where he writes, "We hold the Jewish people in special regard because of their covenant with God has never been revoked. For the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable." I don't know why I can't say that word. I even practiced it and it just didn't come out right. So he's using a new hermeneutic or interpretive technique to say that even within Christian scripture, it never says that God's relationship and covenant with the Jews has ended. And so he cites Romans 11:29. And Romans chapters 9 to 11 become a very important part of Christian-Jewish relationships in the 20th century. The church, which shares with Jews an important part of the sacred scriptures, looks upon the people of the covenant and their faith as one of the sacred roots of her own Christian identity. So they're part of a family. As Christians, we cannot consider Judaism as a foreign religion, nor do we include the Jews among those called to turn from idols and serve the true God. So in other words, there is a special relationship with Christians and Jews. While Catholics have different relationships to other religions, there is something unique among Christians and Jews that need to be celebrated theologically and practiced. And with them, we believe in the one God who acts in history, and with them, we accept his revealed word. So we're starting to see more of a horizontal relationship between Jews and Christians, not simply a vertical hierarchical one. So remember, I shared that the statues of ecclesia and synagoga. So about 10 years ago, this new statue of synagoga and ecclesia was commissioned by the church, and it's now at St. Joe's University in Philadelphia, where Pope Francis blessed it. On the left, you see synagoga with a Torah scroll, and on the right, you see ecclesia with a New Testament. And they're looking and studying each other's scriptures equally. That now there is a shared and a partnership moving forward between Christians and Jews as part of the Christian repair of supersessionism. And so the post-supersessionists repudiate the belief that Christ's coming entails the abrogation of God's covenant with Jews. And now they speak of two covenants rather than an old and new one. Some of them talk about a first and second testament. Some of them keep it abstract, but replacement theology is taken out of the vocabulary. And post-supersessionist theology is fairly prominent in seminaries around North America. It really depends on the seminaries. And we can talk about that in our discussion. So the 1990s, and I'll jump ahead, there were a number of churches that really catched on to the post-supersessionist theology. And really for the last 40, 50 years have been doing incredible theological work, at least in my opinion, to repair a certain Christian orientation toward violence. Which now leads us to Philo-semitism. Now, Philo-semitism is usually described as a defense, love, or admiration of Jews and Judaism. I love Jews. You can buy this on Amazon. I'm not buying it, but I'm buying, well, not buying it. You're thinking like metaphorically, but I'm not buying that shirt, but it is an interesting one. But there are two questions that come up when we discuss Philo-semitism today. Does it emerge from an understanding of Jews as unique and fulfilling a particular role in history? So even if it's not supersessionist, do Jews play a role in Christian prophecy? Are Jews a tool, or what's called a hermeneutical Jew, sort of a Jew that doesn't really exist, but an idea of a Jew? Or is it the result of a genuine admiration for Jews, Jewish culture, and Judaism? So so there's this idea of holy envy that Krister Stendahl talks about, that you can look at aspects of other people's traditions that you find inspiring, but that you can't actually appropriate for your own. It's antithetical to your own religious tradition and ritual, but you have a deep admiration for it. So I have a colleague in Minnesota whose mother passed away, I'd say about 5 years ago, and he's Lutheran, and he we spent hours on the phone where he talked about Shiva and how the ritual of Shiva is the most humane and the most sacred that he can imagine. There is no Shiva in Lutheran tradition. And so he talked about this genuine love and admiration for this ritual practice that then he associated with a certain Jewish orientation to human beings. That's probably Philo-Semitic in some way. So I want us to keep those two things in tension. So there is a Christian history of Philo-Semitism. So in supersessionism, there's the violent aspect of it and the replacement, but there are actually Philo-Semitic Christian theologians too. So Cerinthus is not a well-known Christian theologian. He's actually one of the firsts. He is of the understanding that Jesus was a Jewish man, and that the connection to Christians to Christ is a connection to the teachings of Torah. And so for Cerinthus, Jews and Christians are one of the same mold, and that Jews that continue to practice Judaism without Christ are just as important as Christians who do. When you get to Apollinarius, you start to get these rejections of Marcionism, rejections of these evil demiurges, but you start to find ideas of Jews being relevant to Christian theology that doesn't require them to be replaced. So an admiration for Hebrew language, an admiration for ritual. And we start to see these things in Apollinarius. And then we have the Dutch and English Calvinists that are starting to develop these, not always, um, more radical connections to Jews and Judaism. And then, of course, the radical German pietists. But when we get to the 19th century, something happens that makes Philo-semitism, supersessionism, and anti-Semitism sort of boil in the same pot. And so this intense-looking individual is Georg Wilhelm Friedrich von Hegel. Right, so Hegel is required reading for most humanities college students, and most people learn about his thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and the idea of sublimation in history. What I want to focus on is this quote from his lectures on the history of philosophy in 1822. The state makes history. Only collective groups with political sovereignty and territorial boundaries have the potential to act on the world scene as a collective group. So what happens is with supersessionist ideas, only certain people can form collectively into a nation state, Jews not being one of them. So Hegel believes that Jews are incapable because they are replaced. And that would be an anachronism. And they don't have the creativity, the language, the culture, or the thought to maintain this type of political sovereignty. But what's also important is that self-identity now, rather than being in a relationship to God, becomes one in relationship to land and state. And so we're going to see that Philo-semitism and supersessionism are going to be understood differently. So Wilhelm Marr, who many of you may know as the founder of the term anti-Semitism, is operating in this milieu of supersessionism and Philo-semitism. And I'll get to the Philo-semitism in a second. In his pamphlet, The Victory of Judaism Over Germandom, Marr coins the term anti-Semite. So it's not enough that Jews can't self-organize, but because of their very nature, they're always going to undermine the people in those particular cultures. So if Germandom, if Deutschtum, if the land of Germany is not reaching its full potential, it's not because Germans themselves are unable to do it. It's because they have to carry Jews with them. That Jews are an anathema to the cultural idea. And he coins the term anti-Semite actually as a positive, that he's pro-German and anti-Semite. So trying to racialize Jews in parts of this, they are not like us, they're biologically different, and we are superior to them. So taking that supersessionist point of view. Woe to the conquered is the pamphlet's motto. So you start to see the seeds of these Jewish conspiracies in the sense that because Jews are politically and socially and theologically inadequate, they spend most of their time having only connections to one another, to other Jews. They're only faithful to other Jews. And their goal is to divide societies in order to take them over. And this, he puts forth an accusation by which the word Philo-semitism is going to come into being. The German liberalism, remember I talked about the Spinozaism during the Enlightenment, right? Allowed Jews to take over Germany. This idea that people who are alien to German culture are allowed to participate in it, even though their very modus operandi, their very mode of operating is to destroy German. This proclivity to be kind, polite, or to afford people different rights in different places is what allowed Germany to become weak. And so anti-Semitism is a proud term to say, we do not want Jews to destroy Germany. It's a political term saying that liberalism allows foreigners to undermine the sanctity of our culture. I'm going to skip this slide and then move to Friedrich Nietzsche, the Philo-semitism of the 19th century. So Nietzsche is a fascinating character, as some of you may know. And he talks about being an anti-Semite. So he mocks the culture that I just described. And in a number of contexts, he talks about how if he were to be culture, cultured, and the word in German is Bildung, which means acculturated. It's the idea that language, thought, music, aesthetics, it's kind of like the midot in rabbinic tradition. They build an inner character that is amenable to decency and democracy. And Nietzsche said that the Jews have this, not Christians, that Christianity is a tradition that oppresses itself in order to justify its own violence. Nietzsche was a provocateur. But there's the question as whether or not his work is philo-Semitic or anti-Semitic, because as some of you know, the Nazis loved his concept of the Übermensch, the one who transcends his particular circumstance, or eradicates his own weakness. And because Nietzsche is very critical of religion writ large, he does say negative things about Judaism. And he does so in the context of saying negative things pretty much about all religions. But some of those statements can be interpreted anti-Semitically. But he also talks about his love of Jews. And so there's this question, I think, among scholars of Nietzsche as to whether or not he's philo-Semitic or anti-Semitic. But defining one's identity in relation to Jews and or Judaism was a common feature in the development of European nationalism. So like with Christianity, to be Christian meant to be not Jewish, to be European, whatever that meant, German, um, Polish, meant not to be Jewish. Different countries had different laws, but culturally there was that supersessionist understanding. Now, Heinrich von Trotzke, um, an anti, one of the proud anti-Semites, was a historian, and there's some evidence that he coined the term Philo-semitism. That Philo-semitism was used anti-Semitically to denounce exaggerated friendliness towards Jews. That those in liberal traditions in Germany um, elevate Jewish genius, Jewish creativity as a way of trying to justify their political advocacy for Jews. And that when people wanted to insult one another politically in Germany, they would call each other Philo-Semites. Anti-Semites would call each other Philo-Semites as a way of saying you're weak, you're thoughtless, you're not thinking about the collective fate of our culture and society. Now, Philo-Semitism in the English language, and this is now some of you can debate this. I don't know this for sure, but I'm fairly certain it comes from Cecil Roth's book, The Life of Menashe ben Israel. Um, it's on page 134 for the if you're interested. So he uses the term, and he's using it not to refer to anti-Semitism, but rather to Judaizing Christians. And so, in the last few minutes of this section, what I'll do is I want to talk about Christian Hebraism. Um, Christian Hebraism has actually a much longer history than just 18th and 19th century Europe, and in this case with Alexander McCall, England. But the idea that the Christians who were not anti-Semitic and were not necessarily supersessionists still sought to convert Jews to Christianity because they wanted to bring upon the redemption. That when all the Jews had converted, it will bring on a messianic age. And so Alexander McCall and his colleagues in London developed a program in the 1820s and 30s to learn Hebrew. They translated the New Testament into Hebrew, and they spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe trying to convert Jews based on this shared love of Hebrew language. It's a long, wonderfully bizarre, inspiring, and confusing history that has made its way into the 21st century. And we'll put that as a footnote, maybe for another time. But I think one of the most important parts about this is that as they learn about Judaism, as they learn about Hebrew, a lot of these folks that go out to Eastern Europe actually develop relationships with Jews and a deeper connection to Judaism. And so while there's this idea that they want to convert them, the mission becomes less pronounced. And it really, in a number of cases, becomes one of building relationships. There's a rabbi, part of the Soloveitchik family, Zvi Soloveitchik in the 19th century, who offers his own Hebrew translation of the New Testament, interestingly, called the Kol Koreh, in which he argues that a better understanding of Jesus would be a Maimonidean understanding, that Jesus was simply a teacher that was misunderstood by his students. This leads finally to Allo-Semitism. And Allo-Semitism is not Philo-Semitism, it's not anti-Semitism. It's the Christian idea that the Christians should offer positive appraisals of Judaism while preserving strict separation of the tradition. So they don't want to synthesize Jews and Christians into one tradition. They also don't want to bring Judaism into the bosom of Christianity. They just want to appreciate it at a distance. Um, and this has positive and negative interpretations, as you might imagine. But I think a really important person in this is George Foot Moore's text. He was a Hebraist at Harvard in the 20s, Christian Writers on Judaism. And it was a classical approach to Allo-Semitism. So Foot Moore was actually fighting anti-Semitism from a Christian theological perspective. And he wanted to understand Christianity on its own terms and Judaism on its own terms from what we would later talk about as a post-colonial perspective, although I'm putting words in his mouth. His idea was that Christians develop a language of faith that is not translatable to Judaism. And so when you force Jews to speak the language of Christianity, they sound silly in the same way that Christians would sound silly speaking the language of Judaism. That there are some things that are just not translatable, and you have to let them be. And so Allo-Semitism, while it doesn't really find a home in many Christian movements, it was very important, at least in the 20s, in the fight against anti-Semitism, especially actually at the same time that the protocols of the Elders of Zion are starting to take root in the American political imagination in the 20s, which is something that we'll talk about later. So I want to get so I'm going to jump ahead past the Buber anecdote. I always have to put Buber in, but we're going to have to skip him today. So is Philo-Semitism anti-Semitic? Well, both attribute to Judaism a significance above that of other peoples and religions, but both do so differently, right? So anti-Semitism and Philo-Semitism attribute something special to Judaism. Philo-Semitism, at least in the 21st century, usually occurs in the context of eschatology, attributing to Jews a special role at the end of times, which I want to focus on now for the next 5 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion. So where are we today? So we're going to be going to the Museum of the Bible. And the folks that you see in this picture are at the Capitol riot. And as Matt may have told you, a lot of the people who planned the Capitol riot did so at the museum. And that the museum is now taking a special place among a lot of the Christian nationalists, as well as Messianic Jews, and some small number of Jewish people. But if you see on the shofar, you see the lion in Jerusalem, the American flag, the Israeli flag, a man wearing a Bukhari kippah and talit. I don't know if he's Jewish or not, but there is this idea that Israel and Jerusalem, DC and America have this important relationship, and that Jews are going to play a very important role in these Pentecostal and evangelical movements as we move forward. And so now we run into this strange contradiction, right? So those of you who remember back in November, the March for Israel to free the hostages and against anti-Semitism, the only religious speaker that day was John Hagee. And John Hagee is an evangelical who, on the one hand, is saying that he's against anti-Semitism and wanting to fight against anti-Semitism. On the other hand, he's famous for this particular statement Behold, I will send for many fishers, and after that I will send for many hunters, and they, the hunters, shall hunt. That would be the Jews. Then God sent a hunter. A hunter is someone who with a comes with a gun and he forces you. Hitler was a hunter. And Hagee's argument was simply that God was punishing the Jewish people in Europe for not being Zionist, and that Hitler was an instrument of God to punish Jews for their lack of faith. And yet at the same time, this is a supersessionist, deeply troubling theological view. At the same time, he's advocating for the state of Israel and possibly for Jewish people. And then at the opening of the embassy in Jerusalem, one of the major religious figures to speak was Richard Jeffress, who also says that he is fighting anti-Semitism and espouses a deep love for the state of Israel. And he says, not only do religions like Mormonism, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, not only do they lead people away from the true God, they lead people to an eternity of separation from God in hell. Hell is going to be filled with good religious people who have rejected the truth of Christ. Judaism, you can't be saved being a Jew. You know, you know who said that, by the way? The three greatest Jews in the New Testament, Peter, Paul, and Jesus Christ. They all said Judaism won't do it. It's faith in Jesus Christ. So at this moment, that's between the United States and Israel, between Jews and Christians, he's speaking as an advocate for the state of Israel and presumably someone who is fighting anti-Semitism. It becomes very confusing for an American Jewish mind. And then finally, when the museum opened, Netanyahu sends warm greetings from Jerusalem. Judaism is the star at the Bible Museum built by Hobby Lobby. Newest DC institution celebrates Jewish origins. Israel ambassador to the US and host of Israeli dignitaries attend opening ceremony. So this is from 2017. So I want to open it up for a conversation. I know I went through a lot. Um, what's what's on your mind? Are you a little nervous about going to this museum? Do you have questions that I missed, maybe with philo-semitism and supersessionism? I turned my camera off, so I couldn't see any of your reactions. I didn't know if you were laughing at my jokes or if you were falling asleep. So,
L-
um,
Let me jump in and say anybody that wants to ask a question, you may raise your hand, or if you want to put it
order,
in
yeah.
the chat, I can read questions from the chat if somebody doesn't want to. I want to kick things off by just coming back, Ben, to the slide that you had about Netanyahu and Israelis at the opening of the museum, because that just raises all kinds of hackles and questions about, do they not see the supersessionism? Do they really believe that this museum honors and benefits Jews? And if so, why is that not true? Are they wrong?
Oh, so you want to go right in? Yeah. Okay. So, um, I think, as some of you know, Netanyahu has had somewhat of a tempestuous relationship with American Jewry. Um, and for those of you who know Hebrew and have seen interviews of him in Hebrew, know that he doesn't always say very nice things about us, or the United States. And so the question really for me would be then, who is the real Netanyahu? He's a politician. He often thinks about his political survival. From what people write about him, he's not someone that really takes seriously many other people's points of view. The question as to whether or not he really thinks this is genuine, I'm going to guess no. But there is a practical element because, as they have talked about in Israel and the U.S., there is a fear that liberal Jews, as they become more attuned to the realities on the ground in Israel with the occupation, with the rise of religious nationalism, of secular nationalism, that's not really in tune with a liberal Jewish sensibility, that they may have to find allies elsewhere. And Christian Zionists have been allies before even before Jewish Zionism. And Netanyahu knows this. So I think it's strategic. I don't know that it comes from a genuine trust. Um, but I'll leave that to the political commentators because I think that the sort of cynicism that comes from the Israeli right when it comes to Amer American evangelicals is pretty widely known. And I think that a lot of them espouse these views. What they really believe is always an open question. All right, so I see a hand. So Mark.
Go ahead.
Hi, it's Lenore Myers. I'm here with Mark in the same room, so I jumped
Oh,
over.
hi, Lenore.
To not confuse the microphones.
Yeah.
So I have two really, really non-academic observations and questions. For the last couple of years, I've been sitting a couple of times a month looking first with the Hebrew Bible, which they would call the Old Testament, and now the New Testament, with a group of people in a senior center who I would call evangelicals. And it's been really eye-opening for me because I've never had this experience contact before. And my first observation is, and everybody may know this but me, but I mean, I'm sitting there with my Tanakh, and every single thing in there is about Jesus, according to them. And I'm like, no, this book stands on its own. And they're like, no, it's all about Jesus. So my first comment is that really feels like supersessionism to me. I mean, it's maybe not what you're talking about, but the idea that it's all about Jesus and not what we think it's about, to me, is supersessionist. My second comment is we just started looking at the New Testament, and we were a little bit in the Gospels, and we're a little bit into Mark. And this is totally new to me. I've never looked at the New Testament before. And reading the little bit that we've read, it's so clear, like the Jews want to kill Jesus. Jesus knows this. Blah. I mean, it's like, how could the Pope or any of these people not see it as this sort of blatant, like, Jesus came, the Jews were bad, y'all got to believe in Jesus, because that's the truth. Because it just seems so basically right there. But again, I don't have any academic background.
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question and I'll move backwards. So the issue with the New Testament is most of it is our letters, the epistles. And the Gospels themselves are written at different times. If you were to read it as scripture, you're going to run into also a lot of different contradictions because the Gospels say different things about Jews and Jesus. Mark, I believe, is one of the earliest ones. I think that when post-supersessionists read the New Testament, they read it very much like you would read the Talmud, in the sense that you're going to have machloket. You're going to have this sacred arguing, this disagreement. And so you have to make choices. You can make bad choices. You can make good choices. You can make choices that are relevant for that particular moment in time. And you can make choices that are better. And that an interpretive tradition religiously is one in which you have a lived relationship between the interpreter and the text, that you would never want the peshat, the literal meaning. So the post-supersessionists look to both theology and history to show when people make bad decisions and when they make good decisions. The first question, seeing Jesus everywhere. So in theology, in Christian theology, that's called topography, right? So it's sort of like you have a decoder lens that's Jesus, and everything you see is Jesus. In many ways, that is supersessionist, for sure. But how you interpret that supersessionism is a way of orienting how you're going to relate to Jews. So what does that mean? It means that you can believe that the New Testament was replacing the Old Testament in the way that the Talmud replaces Tanakh. You say, well, the Talmud doesn't replace Tanakh. Well, for 1,500 years, Judaism was studied through rabbinic Judaism and through Tanakh. It was never through scripture alone, with the exception of the Karaites, who have a really interesting history. And so Christians want to say that we're doing something similar in that fashion. whether or not they do it well, I leave that to Christians. I think the greater issue is, for me as a reader of both, is why should Jews matter in either context, right? It's an unusual feeling to be a Jewish person in certain Christian contexts, which I very often am as like a professional Jew, to hear so much about me and my people and my religion in such an abstract sense, right? So and that goes with anti-Semitism too. And a joke that I always think about, when Jews are controlling the world, they obviously haven't been to my family's Passover Seder, right? Like we can't even agree on what to eat, let alone on like how we're going to destroy and unsettle nations and economies. Um, but I think part of the issue too is it's not just Christianity, but it's just this human proclivity towards order, right? So something that it's sort of relevant in the sense that if you believe yourself superior as a Christian, but things aren't going your way, right? So you're not as wealthy, um, you're not as powerful, you're not as respected. There is that impulse to say, well, the order is the right order of things because it's a Christian world, so it can't be my fault. It must be someone else's, and it's the Jews. And we see that even today, right? If capitalism as an economic system is supposed to be the most natural and the most ethical, and I'm saying that I actually don't believe that, but saying that in terms of how we're living in society, if you're not benefiting in that system, even though you're doing all the right things, it must be something else. And if you believe yourself superior, then it's easy for those things to take root. I think the post-supersessionists are trying to challenge that. I want to look into the chat. I see I'm looking up. Oh yeah, the Amy Jill Levine's book is excellent on that. And with Mark Bretler. I love that book. And it's actually my colleague Heather and I taught that book. It should be on our ICJS library if you want an introduction to it. So I'm not very clear how Christian nationalists incorporate supersessionism and philo-semitism. Oh yeah, good. And how do we get to the seven mountains in Matt's video? Yeah, how do we get to the seven mountains? That's more of a Matt question. The seven mountains to me are still sort of like I'm in Mordor, or and like I'm like a little hobbit. I don't, all of that stuff sounds crazy to me, because if Jews are the ones that are supposed to be taking over the world and have a plan to take over the world, how do we not see that we have these Pentecostals and nationalists saying we need to take over the world and here's how we're going to do it? There are these seven mountains. You have culture and education, like all of these things, and they're doing it. They're literally doing it in front of our eyes. They're taking the worst anti-Semitic tropes and they're applying them to themselves. So it's weird for me. So how do you incorporate supersessionism and philo-semitism? It actually has to do with the state of Israel. The state of Israel figures very prominently in their eschatology because of a certain 19th century idea that when Jews organize and return to the land of Israel, that ushers a return of Jesus. And Jesus will give Jews a choice, right? Convert or die. And either way, the world will be a better place, because in the end, there will be no more Jews, right? That's the basic idea. They are philo-Semitic in that they love Israel. They have Israeli flags on everything. And what Israel means to them is complicated, and it differs from each pastor. I mean, I sometimes eavesdrop on Matt's interviews because he does them in the office, and our offices are next to each other. And I admire Matt's patience, because some of the things I have a propensity to try to make sense of things as an academic. He lets them just speak, and does the Peshat, the simple reading. But when we get to the museum, this is something that we want to debrief on and talk about. What are certain things that you see at the museum that feed into a Christian nationalism, a philo-semitism, supersessionism? I mean, there's a whole floor at the museum dedicated to Jewish readings of Scripture. Um, any other? Oh, what is it about the Talmud that caused Christianity to reject it? Well, so Christianity rejected um, Judaism before the Talmud, or before it was canonized. Within the Talmud, which probably takes about 400 or 500 years to really crystallize, there are also things said about Jesus that wouldn't make Christians very happy. And part of that comes out of the culture of persecution. Um, so when some of these things were translated into English, anti-Semites were saying, see, look, Jews loathed us the whole time, rather than, of course, they're going to say nasty things about Jesus because they're persecuted. Um, they reject the Talmud simply because it's not um, justifying the divinity of Jesus. I should also say that when I say the divinity of Jesus, know that there is a 1700-year-old tradition debating what that actually means. And I took several courses in grad school on Christology, and I'm going to be 50 this year, and I still couldn't tell you what Christology fully is in a comprehensive or meaningful way. It's a really complicated theological idea. What do we have here? Oh, I asked this, Matt, too. Do you have any book recommendations if we want to learn more about these topics? Yeah. So Philo-semitism, you won't really find any like books on what is Philo-semitism. There are some academic books like Philo-semitism in History. And I probably should have had this available. We could send them out later. It's a collection of essays about the history of Philo-semitism, primarily in the 19th century, but some of the early Philo-Semites. Um, Supersessionism, there are a ton of books. And what I'll do is after the call, I'll put together a few books. Because some of the stories about supersessionism I actually find quite inspiring. I used to have a really bad taste in my mouth in trying to engage Christianity. And I've really learned to admire the theological work of the last 50 or 60 years. It's required an incredible amount of humility and patience that I think theologically are exciting. Um, I see a hand up. Uh, oh, you're back. Donna, hi.
Thanks. Uh, it's a big question, so I'll settle for just getting your top of the head reaction.
Sure.
What do you think of irony as maybe the best criterion for parsing Philo-semitism and anti-Semitism? I'm thinking of William Shakespeare, and I've taught William Shakespeare. I've taught The Merchant of Venice as Torah study, and I think there's extraordinary coding going on there, so that he writes, on one level to make it palatable make The Merchant of Venice palatable for his audience, but then underneath there's underneath there's something else going on. Look at The Quality of Mercy, Portia's speech at the end. I think it's very ironic, and I'm wondering if irony is a useful. What do you think of irony as a criterion? I find the current government of Israel alarmingly unironic, and I think that's
Well, you're not alone.
the problem.
That there's well, the way you described irony.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the way you described it, I think could be useful in unpacking some of these tensions. I think so. David Nirenberg, who was in Baltimore many years ago, wrote I think, a fantastic book called the Anti-Judaism, something like Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition.
That's it.
Yeah, it's like 900 pages long, but it is worth like every word, because he develops this intellectual history of how, and maybe it is irony in some contexts, of how anti-Judaism informs every aspect of intellectual traditions and self-identity. in ways in which Jews never existed in certain places, and you have anti-Judaism, politics. And I think as a book, what it shows is that when it becomes this trope and how dangerous this trope becomes, it has the potential for violence in some contexts, but it's always a choice. It doesn't always have to be that way. And so what I admire about that particular work is that sometimes when you read histories, right, you read it backwards in that it had to be this way, that you have a cause and effect leading to this event. And he's saying, no, it never actually had to lead to this. And he's examining the choices that an anti-Jewish worldview opens up. And they're usually not good choices. I would recommend that book. I know it's a way of maybe skirting the question of irony in this context, but I think it is amenable to your observation. So there's another hand up. Benjamin Norbert.
Yeah, that's thanks. It's Sharon, Benjamin, and David.
Oh,
Just
oh,
a
hi.
quick question about what is Hobby Lobby in all of this? Thanks.
Oh, right. That's an important piece. Hobby Lobby is the one who put up all the money to support the museum. Hobby Lobby is the organization that's putting up all of the money to support legislation that supports Christian nationalist ends. And Hobby Lobby was also complicit in stealing antiquities from Iraq and Afghanistan to put in that museum. Some might say as a form of supersessionism because they felt entitled to it as Christians. So yeah, Hobby Lobby is probably one of the most important factors in all of this as a corporation. And I'm glad you asked that too, because had I not looked into any of this material, I would have never known what Hobby Lobby is. I don't know that I've ever seen a Hobby Lobby, even though I'm sure I drive past it. But apparently they are a political powerhouse in this world. Yeah, I'm sure some of you might know far more than I do about Hobby Lobby. I know what Matt tells me, and that he tells me that they're doing some nefarious things politically. I think they were also involved in trying to undermine Obamacare with the abortion issue. Yeah, so it's a cultural issue. I realize that we've gone way over time, and that's my fault because I spoke a lot. I'm willing to stay on for a few more minutes if you have any more questions or want to share any observations. I hope that you're adequately prepared for this. Our goal is sort of like an intervention. The Museum of the Bible sort of goes under the radar, I think, in most of our communities. And it's a major cultural force right now. And it's a cultural, and I'm not going to tell you much about going in, but I would like you to observe who the advisors were to the museum, who the advisors were to exhibits, and to know that it's far more complicated than we're leading on to. That a lot of us have our hands in this in ways that we couldn't have imagined, and something to think about. Can I say more about the connection between the museum and the planning of the insurrection? I wasn't aware of that connection. So Matt, in his research, has shown that the Museum of the Bible became a base for a lot of those that were coordinating the attacks. And it is currently serving as the new Trump hotel. So during the Trump administration, his hotel that was down the street from the White House became the place where a lot of Republican operatives and those that are deeply ensconced in the Republican Party were doing a lot of their planning. And then the National Prayer Breakfast. All of those things are now taking place in the Museum of the Bible. Apparently, Mike Evans has been holding meetings there. Mike Evans. What did I?
Mike Johnson.
Mike Johnson is holding meetings there. it's a place where you're going to find the more radical elements of the Republican Party these days. And maybe they're not so radical anymore, but at least at the time, and as the characters who are involved, they're still not fully mainstream. It's a lot of these folks like Dutch Sheets and Shay On, who Matt I think Matt talked about. They're in the film. They have deep connections to the museum. And there are actually several books about the museum that are worth reading that I will put um, into the email. Yeah, if you're interested, also years ago, I got a grant from the state of Virginia to research religion and amusement parks. And so I spent time at the Creation Museum and at the Holy Land Experience to see how both Pentecostals and evangelicals deal with amusement parks in telling their narratives. And what's interesting to me is that the Creation Museum has a far deeper connection to the Museum of the Bible than, well, the Holy Land Experience is no longer in Orlando. But one observation I found is that Pentecostals tended to be more open to difference, interestingly, than evangelicals were. But I don't know that that's the case anymore. Good.
I just
Great.
want to I just want to point out that the RAC hosted those who crafted civil rights legislation, so that might be an ironic predecessor.
The who?
The RAC, the Religious Action Center.
Yeah. Yeah, I like this theme of irony. I'm going to take some notes on that.
Yeah, I suggest Jonathan Lear's book on the uses, Tanner Lectures of the Uses of Irony. Yeah, it's a good place to start. Because I think we're going to have to get the gift of irony back and use it to subvert some pretty dangerous stuff.
Are you going to go on, are you going on the trip? Can I sit near you on the bus?
I'm a rabbi, I charge by the
You charge. Wait, I'm a doctor, I guess. Um, anything, I mean, I'm glad that you're, yeah. Stephen. Oh, you're muted.
There we go.
There you go. Yeah.
I'd just like to say this in defense of the people who own Hobby Lobby, right? Because it's a private company.
Yeah.
The people who own it actually own it. They're not like Elon Musk who kind of controls a company that's a public company. It's a private company. It's theirs. And you know, they're as successful with their agenda as they are because they're 100% devoted to that. That's what they use all the money that Hobby Lobby generates for. You know, they're not kind of saying, well, we'll use 10% of our money for this.
Right. Well, they're transparent
100%.
about it. Yeah.
You know, they may be partisans for bad causes, but they're determined partisans for bad causes. They're very systematic and they're very strategic in the way they think about these things.
Oh, from what I hear, I mean, I don't know. I'm in a position to agree or disagree, but I've heard other people say that too. I think it is helpful. Um, I think that the folks that are doing this are transparent about it, and so the questions that we've been asking ourselves at the Institute through Matt's research is why are we not taking them seriously? They're telling us what they want to do. And this museum is an important porthole into a certain worldview that is making sense to more and more of our compatriots. I I'll say this just like in a dialogical context. I learn about this not in the effort to fight a culture war, because I don't know, at least, that you can convince people in any way that I could be convinced of their point of view. But I do think there are dialogical possibilities in trying to understand a point of view as a way of changing the potential dangerous directions in the way that David Nierenberg talks about anti-Judaism. Um, I don't know that this will actually happen, but I think that this museum is an experience, is a way for us to connect with people that we're not just going to connect with, and 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 for them to see us as in ways that we can see them in all of our diversity, complexity, and everything else. Like, there are parts of the museum that I was embarrassed to say that I really enjoyed. I liked Maimonides narrating. I mean, I had never been in a place where Maimonides spoke with a British accent and was talking about Torah. I mean, that's kind of cool. Um, I mean, you have to have some suspension of disbelief, but uh, I wanted to at least have that moment rather than constantly question the motivations of those who put that there. Um, I also don't always know that people who espouse the religion know much about it sometimes, most of the time. So yeah, I just wanted to be vulnerable for a second. That it's an intervention that we want to learn about something that's happening in our American context, but we're we're in this together, whether we like it or not. And so maybe this movement can instigate movements in other directions too. I don't think any of us are going to walk out convinced that the truth of the Museum of the Bible is actually true. But you do get a sense of where people are coming from, their fears, and some things are truly terrifying. But, well, anyway. Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene, opposition to the bill adopting IHRA. Yeah. Because the Jews killed, yeah. Definitions of anti-Semitism are always going to be bedeviled by definitional ambiguity. It's hard to imagine anti-Semitism without Christianity, but here we are. Yeah.